My name is Michael Anderson. I'm the president and CEO of the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. And I'm very pleased this evening to be touring everyone through one of our most unique and formative collections, our Beaux Arts collection. And, there are certainly some disadvantages to doing a virtual tour. The first is sometimes the presenter will mute himself and speak, in space and in a void. Secondly, I can't see any of you. I hope some of you are laughing with me or at me right now. I don't know if that's the case or not. I hope it is. And the third, maybe really the biggest issue with doing a virtual presentation is that you can't stand in front of the works that we're going to be talking about. These are works that really do deserve for you to spend time in their presence, and I hope that you do come back after this presentation and spend some time looking through our Beaux Arts collection. But there are also advantages to doing a virtual tour. The first of those is that we can spend time and that we can show you some really interesting details of the works in our Beaux Arts collection. And this, I should say, is going to be a tour of the works in the collection. We're going to be looking at the collection a little bit more than the history. We're going to really spend time looking at the works of art. And again, encouraging you to come back and see those in person. Another advantage is that we're not locked into one space or even one time. So we will be touring through the collection. You'll see the galleries the way that they appear now at the museum. But not all the works are on view right now. They will be by the end of the spring, but we're going to be looking at some of those works. And there's even some works that I have at least in one slide that aren't even in the collection, but they're pertinent to what we'll be talking about today. So there's some limitations that this virtual format does do away with. So I'm just going to take a second now and share my screen. We will be looking here momentarily at the Beaux Arts collection. Okay, and I believe you can see my the first slide, the Beaux Arts collection. And let me just go ahead to our second here. This is an overview of the Beaux Arts collection at a glance. Here we see really one of the most important and formative people to the Beaux Arts collection, and that's Eleanor Blake Kirkpatrick. So she was one of the people who was absolutely instrumental in creating the Beaux Arts Society to fundraise for the museum. The first Beaux Arts ball, which was envisioned as a costume fundraiser, occurred in 1945, and it raised $2,500 to pay for the Art Center's operating expenses, an incredibly small number, which of course has grown exponentially over the years. But even a year later, in 1946, it became a debutante event. And then by the mid-1960s, the Beaux Arts funds, so the money raised by the Beaux Arts Society every year, started to go to museum purchases. And what you're going to see now is a series of those purchases that really do provide one of our great collections as a museum. It's by no means an exaggeration to say that our museum collection wouldn't be any sort of shred of what it is without the Beaux Arts Society and without the Beaux Arts fundraiser every year. It really has made for a wonderful collection in our city, and you'll see that. But it's also a very unusual collection, and I hope that's something that comes across. The first Beaux Arts acquisition was made in 1965. It was a Rembrandt etching that we have on view now, The Raising of Lazarus. It was actually purchased at a Sears in rural Oklahoma, which there was a time when when you could buy Rembrandts at Sears's. I don't think you can today. I haven't looked at a Sears lately, but I don't think you can buy Rembrandts today. 2002, so Eleanor Blake Kirkpatrick, you see, in her honor, the Beaux Arts Committee commissioned our Chihuly Tower. So one of the most really signature pieces of the museum's collection, the piece that literally this museum was built around, was built in Eleanor Blake Kirkpatrick's honor. And one other thing I would add, and we'll see it even on the next slide, is that work after work, she was actually the chair of the acquisitions committee, so she had a big hand in choosing a lot of these pieces as well. And again, this is a collection that consists of 37 objects, all of which will be on display this spring at the museum. So now I'm going to bring you to our current exhibition. So the way that this kind of works is we have an exhibition on view now, the Beaux Arts at 75, which is the bulk of this collection. But then there are other pieces that are scattered throughout our galleries, and then we have an exhibition opening in the spring that will include the remainder of the pieces that are not currently on view. But we will begin in that collection that's currently on view, the Beaux Arts of 75. And here I think is, in this gallery, even in the typeface and certainly in the type of works in this Everett Shinn that you see on the screen, these are the sorts of pieces I think that one would associate with a pretty title like the Beaux Arts. So you would think, I think, of a Ballerina. This is a piece that the museum purchased in 1971. It was actually in the Algonquin Hotel in New York. It was part of a larger mural. They cut this piece out of the mural, sold those as separate paintings. The museum purchased it with the actually thumbs up of the Beaux Arts Society at that time. And again, Eleanor Blake Kirkpatrick was the person who signed off on that acquisition as the chair of that committee. So this first piece that you see is very much what we might associate with the name Beaux Arts. It's something pretty, it's that, Prussian blue color. It's just puts us in mind, I think, of the sort of elegance that we might associate with the word Beaux Arts. And in this first gallery, I think you see a lot of that. You also see a very interesting architectural feature. So if we're looking at the screen, the image on the left, you see the Beaux Arts of 75 type on the top, and then there's that line that goes down. And what that actually is it's a way that we are showing our Reginald Marsh, which is a two-sided work. So for the first time, you can see both front and back. So this, if you've ever seen the chorus on the left, you can come back and see the soldier on the right, which we very rarely exhibit. So this is a great opportunity to see all of the collection, and by all of the collection, I even mean the back of one of the works. So this is an opportunity to see really, the totality of what Beaux Arts has meant to the museum over the years. But if you look at both of these images, there are two very interesting works that you see on this side of either image. So if you look to the right of the chorus or to the left of the soldier, these two works are works that we're going to look at now as part of the first gallery. And as we go through this, I'm going to kind of point out some details. So when you do come back to the museum, when you do explore the Beaux Arts collection, which again, you're very much encouraged to do, you know what to be looking for, what's important in each of these works. And this first piece is a nude by Childe Hassam, who is one of, if not the most important, of the American Impressionists. So if you think of the French Impressionists, you know their names, Monet, Manet, and so on. There was an American school that followed, and in the early 20th century, Childe Hassam painted this nude. And what is really, I think, remarkable about this particular piece on view right now in the Beaux Arts of 75 is the idea and the sense of touch that you get with this. So that's what this, detail on the right is about. You can see her, and I swear this is not, I'm not trying to make any, this is not an obscene gesture on my part. She's itching her ear with her middle finger, but that's important because what you see in this work is you see the object of our vision touching herself, scratching herself as she kneels in this soft, maybe cool grass, so you get a second sense of touch. And so this is a painting that very much is all about the sensation, the sense of touch. So she's touching her ear. We can kind of imagine or feel her touching the ground beneath her. She's touching the ground with her right hand as well. So that's very much the focus of this first work that we're looking at. The second piece has a different sense that it builds its entire structure around, and that's the sense of sight. And this is John Sloan's Connoisseurs of Prints from the early 20th century. So like Everett Shinn, he was one of the Ashcan School or the 8 artists. Many of them began their careers as newspaper illustrators. So they had to draw, paint very quickly. Essentially, they were reporters that used the medium of drawing, and eventually they became painters. And so John Sloan is coming out of this tradition. He's also obviously coming out of a cartoon tradition. And you see this here, it's kind of this cartoon-like depiction of stuffy people looking at prints in a gallery. So it's kind of a fun piece to have really in any gallery where it sort of lightens the mood and it gives a sense of proper etiquette, but then also there's, of course, a little bit of humor. But again, this is a work that's all about one sense, and in this particular case, it's the sense of sight. Moving on to another location in the gallery, and this is the piece that you may, if you signed on a little early to the call, you would have seen. This is a work by Kroll, who is another important early 20th century American artist. This is one of his painting compositions from the mid-20th century. And one thing I will say about the Beaux Arts collection is over the years and overwhelmingly since that first purchase of Rembrandt, it has been a collection that has predominantly been, it may even be exclusive. These are works by American artists. So over the years, so since that first work was acquired in 1965, that was, at that time, we still had our first director, Nan Sheets, and then our second, Patrick Shannon, soon followed. And a number of these pieces that you'll see, including that first work by Everett Shinn, were acquired when he was director of the Oklahoma Art Center. Director after director, curators after curator, and really throughout much of it, Eleanor Blake Kirkpatrick, and then subsequent heads of that particular committee, Amalia Silverstein being the latest, they have all been formative in choosing works by American artists that really have created a strong and pretty expansive 20th century American art collection. So this particular work by Leon Kroll, what's really remarkable about it to me is this is a work that's just so general in most of its details. And so you see, you have, and it's very dialogical. You have a brunette and you have a blonde. You have the outside and you have the inside. You see the fruit, so it's a still life and it's a portrait. You have front and you have back. So there are these details that really do work in dialogue with each other. But then with that profile of the background sitter of the blonde, you see that little tip on her nose, and suddenly this sort of really pulls you in a different direction as a painting. So you're looking at everything in generalities, you're looking at everything in these comparisons, and then you get a sense of you're looking at somebody in particular. And that's really, I think, what's the kind of most interesting and magical part about this particular painting. Now I'm going to draw your attention to the work in the next gallery, and this is one of the, I'd say, more shocking in some senses paintings in the collection, and this is a work by Ben Kamihira, another portrait from the, in this case, the 1970s. He was an artist who actually was a Japanese American who was interned in an internment camp during the first part of World War II. Eventually he enlisted in the Army and then paid for art school through the GI Bill. Well, here we see a portrait from the mid-1970s. So there's something, I think, the word, of course, that we would throw out initially would be there's something very sort of frank or erotic about this painting. But let's kind of think of ourselves in this particular period in time. So this is the 1970s at really the height of feminist art. So if we're looking at this as a painting that is maybe naive, I think we need to step back and kind of think about what else is going on in this particular painting. And so we have a couple of details here in the center and on the right that show us objects. So we have that Coke bottle, we have that porcelain blue vase, we have a magazine, a Vogue magazine, and there's even Grand Marnier that's painted on the back cover of that Vogue magazine. So we have different objects. In the image itself, the painting itself, we also see a saxophone. There's actually a pornographic magazine next to the Vogue magazine that's on the couch. So we have all of these objects, and then we have a partially nude woman in this painting. And what we do see in this particular painting is that and then I should mention, she's holding a playing card as well. So we have a series of objects, and we have a woman that is, in some sense, no different than anything else. Because, why? Well, she's also painted. She's also created through pigment. She's the same physical material, the same substance as everything else that we see in this particular painting. And that's really important when we think of this as an artwork from the mid-1970s. Again, this was a time when people were questioning perception, and in particular, they were questioning the viewer's gaze of the woman. There's a very famous film essay from that time. There's some films that were made along the same lines by Laura Mulvey, who's a very famous film theorist. And in the art world, we had artists that were also starting to ask about the gaze. And what's also interesting about this particular piece, and the reason that I think we should really think of this as a less than naive work, this is not a naive piece of art, is that we do have a Coke bottle. So who do we think of when we look at Coke bottles and works of art? Of course, we think of Andy Warhol. So we have that pop dimension. Then there's the composition itself. And she draws and she brings to mind, and if you come to the gallery, there's an illustration of this in the label, so I very much encourage you to do so. She brings to mind a lot of 17th century painters in particular Titian and other artists that were working in Venice. So Ben Kamihira is choosing this composition strategy, and you of course had a lot of nudes in painting at that time. He's bringing in an object from Andy Warhol, and then he's making everything the same. So of course, on the one sense, this seems like a somewhat uncomfortable painting if we look at it as naive, if we're just kind of looking at a naked woman. But when we start to think of these other aspects, we begin to think and ask ourselves, this equality of looking. I mean, are we doing the right thing looking? So this is a challenging work in some sense. And what I really want to focus on here in this second gallery are pieces that are maybe not so nice. So that first gallery, we saw some very pretty works that I think maybe we would associate with the name Beaux Arts. In the second gallery, I think we should be thinking about these works as maybe less than nice. So next, we're looking at a couple of pieces acquired by one of our directors in the mid-1970s from the Midtown Galleries in New York. The work on the left is a piece by Isabelle Bishop, and the work on the right is a piece by Robert Vickrey, and we will look at Carri and Coco is the title of that from 1971. And let's look at that work here for a second. So, maybe first glimpse of this, we think, oh, this is a kind of a nice, even sentimental painting. We have a woman on her bicycle, there's a dog. I mean, this is, very kind of maybe even kitschy if we look at it from that perspective. But what we really should be looking at is, in this painting, what we don't see. So, we'll start with what we do see. So we have, again, the woman on her bicycle, but then we have her long shadow, and we have the long shadow of Coco the dog. So what does that tell us? It tells us that in all likelihood, it's maybe, it's either very early, or let's say it's very late. It's probably more likely from the discourse that we'll see otherwise. So maybe this is, the sun is about to set, the sun is low near the horizon, so we have these very long shadows. So it's about to become nighttime. Then we have the composition itself of the painting. So there is so much that we don't see. The perspective that we're looking at is a little bit above eye level. So what that does is that limits what we see. There's a lot beyond the painting. And actually, you can't quite see it here maybe, but the dog is looking off the painting space. So it's looking at something else that we don't see. I mean, and Carri might not see it herself, but the dog perhaps senses something that's going on beyond our sight in this particular case. And then there's that very conspicuous detail of the manhole cover that we have right in front of us. And what does that do but conceal something else that we can't see or don't see? So we have a setting sun, night's about to come, we can't see what's beyond the painting, the dog notices something the woman doesn't, and we have this hidden, concealed space in the manhole. So far from a sentimental or kitschy painting, this is perhaps a pretty, in some sense, sinister painting. It's a kind of a surreal painting in some sense. And Robert Vickrey is certainly one of the painters from his era. He was a very realistic painter, but a painter who did work within the context of surrealism or a neo-surrealism. So that's really important to the language or to the discourse of this painting. Continuing now in the gallery, we're going to look at a couple of other very unusual pieces from the Beaux Arts collection. And that's what's really, I think, fun about the Beaux Arts collection is it's not necessarily just ballerinas. The Everett Shinn is a beautiful painting. It's one of our great early 20th century paintings. But then we also have this large piece by Annette Lemieux on the left. And we have this Altarpiece for a Dark Age by Dick Mason on the right. Just a footnote on these two before I talk a little bit more about what you're seeing in the paintings. In both cases, these were actually pieces that were acquired by the museum out of exhibitions. The Dick Mason Altarpiece for a Dark Age, if you were around in the late 80s and if you went out to the fairground, you may have seen there was an exhibition at that time, the I-40 Connection, which brought in a number of artists from the American Southwest, Santa Fe in particular. It was kind of organized in conjunction with the gallery, and this was one of the pieces that was in the exhibition. The Oklahoman's review of the exhibition is interesting because it said it's just such a large exhibition, it's almost overwhelming. And this Dick Mason piece was one of the pieces mentioned. So this was a work acquired ahead of, or really kind of in relationship to this contemporary art exhibition that was being done at the fairgrounds at the time. And the piece on the left, the one that we're looking at now by Annette Lemieux, this is Initial Sounds. This was a work that was created for an exhibition at the Ringling Museum. And at that time, the curator for this exhibition actually came on and spent 3 years as the museum's director in the late 80s, early 90s, at the time that the Oklahoma Art Center and the Oklahoma Museum of Art merged and created the kind of present day institution. So some of these earlier pieces are Oklahoma Art Center, and then this is one of the first pieces after the merger. And it's a work that, again, it's a bit of a disconcerting work. So what we see here is the first sounds that a ventriloquist would practice and kind of manipulate with a ventriloquist dummy. So we have e, u, I, o. So we have these sounds, but the effect of the painting is very different. So when you're standing in front of it, and I can't encourage you enough to come back, spend some time. And of course, I think the thing that you'll be startled by as you're looking at it is that it's a very quiet painting. And of course, paintings are quiet. It's a visual art form. But it's a work that does really highlight that aspect of the kind of silence of what you're seeing. So it is a visual piece. It has it's a work that uses appropriation. So we have our famous ventriloquist dummy and the famous ventriloquist appropriated from a number of Hollywood films from pop culture. And then you have the language of the text on the painting. So you have and then you have, according to the artist, a very kind of political discourse. So this is very much about manipulation and how people are manipulated and so on. But what that all really combines to suggest and to point to is a movement that we call when we're studying art history, it's a movement of known as postmodernism. And so what's really interesting, I think, about the Beaux Arts collection is how consistently during the 1970s and 1980s in particular, the museum led by Eleanor Blake Kirkpatrick were buying contemporary artworks that were essentially postmodernist. And so the museum actually acquired a bit of a postmodern collection through the leadership of a number of different directors and then Mrs. Kirkpatrick. And this is one of those examples. She, again, this is 1989, 1990. She was still the chair of the acquisitions committee at that point. And now just moving on to this, one of the strangest paintings in our collection, Dick Mason's Altarpiece for a Dark Age. And what I want to highlight here are these candle holders, brass towers of some sort. And what you can see is the reflections of the Dalmatians in each of those. So what this does as a work of art, and I would kind of, again, suggest that you kind of think about that when you're looking at it in person, is it expands the space both in front of you. So we see kind of this world that's almost made, this is New Mexico, where the artist spent a lot of time. The world is almost transformed into a Dalmatian-like landscape. And then the world exists behind us too, because we see these reflections of the Dalmatians and then the room kind of spreading out behind us. So this is a three-dimensional world. There's a lot of world building that goes on in this Dick Mason painting. And I can't even begin to understand the symbolism of these either two eggs or balls or whatever this is. It's a very strange, a very kitschy, but also kind of a disconcerting work. So it's a very interesting piece and a piece that uses that religious three-piece altarpiece structure and then even has that in the title. So now moving on and moving kind of out of our postmodern work into our modernist work, our postmodern room into our modernist room. We're going to be looking at three pieces now by Joe Goode, who is one of the great artists from our city, Oklahoma City, good friend of Ed Ruscha's. And what's interesting too is that because it was at a time a very contemporary collection, there were a number of modernist or abstract pieces that were also collected through the Beaux Arts Acquisition Fund. And some of these are actually around the same time or predated or just immediately post-dated the acquisition of our large Washington Gallery collection. These three pieces here by Joe Goode give us essentially, I'm going to ask you to look at these as like three different skies, with the first being a kind of a hazy, very pretty, maybe very Oklahoma style landscape where we have kind of that purple, pink and orange. And then looking to the left, we have that rip, and so we have the sense suddenly that this is concealing something, that it's a flat surface, that it is a sheet of paper, which of course it is. And behind then we have that blue landscape, or that blue, skyscape. So we have the kind of perfect sunset, then we have the sunset that's ripped, and we see what's behind the sunset. And then on the third piece, to the right, we've got that kind of trompe l'oeil piece of paper that's tacked onto what becomes a background. So now it's just kind of this, our kind of Oklahoma sky is suddenly just sort of this pretty background, and we have this kind of blue piece of paper that's in an illusionistic way kind of tacked right to the surface of it. So Joe Goode is really, in these three works, this is a very strong piece by our native Oklahoma City artist. He's showing us different ways to look at the flat surface, to think of depth, to think of what we're looking at, sheets of paper, depictions of landscapes, and so on. So it's a very interesting piece from Mr. Goode. And now we're going to be moving outside of our Beaux Arts at 75. So we'll be looking at a few pieces that are in other galleries right now at the museum, and we're going to begin with one that I know that everybody loves. This is Lamont's Shadow from the early 2010s. This is a piece, again, that was acquired because of an exhibition at the museum, Fusion, in the early 2010s. This is a piece from 2012. So this is one of the more recent pieces in the Beaux Arts collection, and it's certainly the youngest artist in the Beaux Arts collection. Ms. Lamont was born in 1967. She's still a very active artist. And here, I think what's, to me, so striking about this piece is that it is, that we're missing a body, that we have this wonderful, very realistic, very detailed glass piece that's a form without a figure, which is something very strange indeed in sculpture. And this is placed in our post-war sculpture gallery. It's glass, but it certainly is a work of sculpture. And actually, Ms. Lamont works in a number of other sculptural media as well. Now, moving back downstairs to the second floor, we have our landscape gallery, and I'm going to look at a couple of pieces. The first, the work on the left, is Thomas Cole's An Italian Autumn, which we acquired just a couple of years ago. So this is the second newest piece in our Beaux Arts collection. The work on the right, George Innes, we'll get to in a second. But this Thomas Cole was a work that we found in a gallery in New York, Hirschman and Adler, just a few years ago. We were looking for a big, really kind of signature piece for the museum. Thomas Cole was very, very high on our list. And, as soon as we saw this in that gallery, we knew that this was a perfect work for our collection. And I'm going to just very briefly kind of detour us now through the past. This is the one work that I mentioned, or rather 5 works that are not in our collection. On the left, you see Thomas Cole's Course of Empire. And I saw one of these yesterday on Twitter with the events in Washington, D.C. I think somebody was sharing the fourth of those images. I believe it's Destruction. But what Thomas Cole created in these 5 works, which are now in the collection of the New York Historical Society, these were painted in the 1830s. He created essentially cyclical. He had a cyclical view of history, that everything kind of started in the sort of primitive wilderness, which you see in the upper left. Then you move into this peaceful Acadia, the second. The third is consummation of empire. It's America, or it's Rome, or it's any other empire really at its peak. The fourth, there's this moment of destruction. And then finally on the bottom, you see desolation. And Thomas Cole's belief, he was a fairly conservative. He was born in Britain but raised in the United States. He was very anti-Jacksonian in his politics. He was a high church Anglican at the time, so he was a very conservative, politically religiously person in the kind of framework of the 19th century. And so he was very concerned with Andrew Jackson's administration. So he actually painted this during the second term of Andrew Jackson's presidency. Thinking that this is what was happening in America in the 1830s. And what we were so fortunate to get when we acquired our own Thomas Cole was a painting that really does bring in multiple elements from what you see on the left. So this is an Italian autumn, an Italian landscape from 1847. And if you look on the upper right of this image, you see a religious pilgrim who's kneeling at an altar. So that's what you see in the kind of left corner. Then I also detailed a woman and her child who are walking over that very treacherous bridge that you see in kind of traversing the middle of the painting. And so what our Beaux Arts Thomas Cole painting does is it in effect gives us the life that kind of comes back after that last step that you see in the course of empires. So, eventually empires rise, they fall, but as Italy in the 19th century was really evidence of for Thomas Cole, he loved Italy a great deal. He spent a good deal of time drawing there, and this is actually based on a drawing that he produced while in Italy, although it is a fictional landscape. He believed that cultures and civilizations rose again as Italy was in the 19th century. So it really is a beautiful, remarkable piece that we were able to acquire, again, thanks exclusively to the various funds that we have, but predominantly to the Beaux Arts collection, and then also to one of our great funders who we'll talk about in a second, James C Meade, one of our great patrons. And actually, we have acquired a number of works in honor of various persons that have relationships to the Beaux Arts over the years. The first was in honor of James G. Harlow Jr., and this is one of our masterpieces. This is an 1893 painting by George Inness. Now, Inness is kind of bracketing the 19th century American landscape tradition with Thomas Cole. He's on the other end. So Thomas Cole painted the painting that you just saw 1 year before his death in 1848, and this is the painted the same year, or actually I believe again 1 year before George Inness's death in 1894. This is the coming storm or approaching storm. Inness, this used to be a painting of Mount Washington. It's a huge canvas, as you'll see in our galleries. And Inness couldn't find another big canvas. He had this flash of inspiration, so he painted over his mountain landscape. And you have now one of his masterpieces, something that when he died, this was a work that was very clearly dear to him and kind of considered to be one of his great works. Under Carolyn Hill's leadership in the early 1990s, and again, with the participation of the Beaux Arts Society, this was purchased in honor of that year's previous Beaux Arts king, James G. Harlow Jr. So this was the first work that was purchased for a king from the Beaux Arts Society in their honor, in their memory, just after he passed away. Again, it's one of the great masterpieces of our collection. And what's really interesting to me about this is that it's about knowledge in some sense. And so many paintings of the 19th century are. I mean, we had a theory of history with those Thomas Cole paintings and even our painting. Here it's about that instinct, that animal knowledge. They know what's about to come, of course. You have the birds flying away, those white dots on the top. You have the cows that are mooing, they're lowing, they're looking in a direction, so they know that a storm's coming. They can feel that, and so it's a sense of this sort of animal instinct, this special kind of knowledge that really does fit within so many of the different frameworks of the 19th century. The next person that we honored through the Beaux Arts collection, of course, is Eleanor Blake Kirkpatrick. John Sloan, the person that you see on the left, he was that artist that I mentioned at the beginning, connoisseur of print. So she was around to acquire this, and then this was acquired in her honor in the mid-1990s. And then, of course, in her memory, the Chihuly Tower, which is certainly the centerpiece of our museum. So fitting, of course, that both of these works were created in her honor, being that she was such a central presence in the formation of our collection and the Beaux Arts collection in particular. And the last person that we've honored through an acquisition using Beaux Arts funds was James C. Meade, who passed away just this past year. And this was he was actually somebody, again, like Eleanor Blake Kirkpatrick, who we worked very closely at the museum to acquire works. So he was instrumental, and his acquisitions funds contributed significantly to purchasing the Thomas Cole, and also to purchasing the painting that you see here on the left. This is John Singleton Copley, who is the great American painter of the 18th century. This is his portrait of Anne Bottineau Robinson, and Mr. Meade and I spent quite a bit of time talking about this acquisition before he passed away. So we were able, through Beaux Arts funds, to purchase this in his honor, and you see this in the center now. It's work that fits perfectly within our collection, and I'm going to advance it, and you'll see that here, this is the, and I'll go back actually for a second. The piece on its left is a painting by Thomas Lawrence, a British painter. John Singleton Copley was the great American painter of the 18th century. And so he was somebody that had aspirations and eventually went back and worked in Britain. So he was somebody that was basically self-trained in the United States, and he painted at a level that was really unparalleled in the United States of the time, or the colonies of the time. And he had to go to Britain in order to fulfill his aspirations of being a history painter. But this is a beautiful portrait. Again, this is something that we just acquired in the past year. It's new to our collection, so come look at it in person. You'll see those beautiful, beautiful pearls, the fur that's hanging over her shoulders. It's actually the same costume that another sitter used, that John Singleton Copley had costumes at his studio that his sitters could wear, and there's another painting from that same time that's illustrated in the label at the museum, so come and see that. This is also the original frame for that work from 1769, and something interesting about Copley is you could choose the size of your painting, which would make it more or less expensive, but then also the kind of quality of your frame, and this was a Rococo, this was a more expensive frame. We have another set of portraits by Copley that we're using his very cheap kind of Dutch style wooden frame. So again, there's so much to be studied and researched. It's such an interesting collection. So this is our most recent acquisition. And now I'm going to close with a plug for an exhibition that we have coming up that will be opening in the middle of February, and that's Moving Vision, Op and Kinetic Art from the 60s and 70s. And we actually acquired 6 works about 4 years ago in preparation for this exhibition. So these will be premiering for the first time. And you see that Reginald Neal on the right is one of those 6 works. So we have this Reginald Neal that will be premiering along with 5 other pieces. These are all pieces that move before your eyes or physically move, as in the case of the Alexander Calder on the left. And the Alexander Calder is another major work acquired when Lowell Adams was the director of the museum, the Oklahoma Art Center in the late 1970s. This is titled Caracas. It's one of his pieces from an exhibition in Caracas, Venezuela in 1955. It's one of the masterpieces of our collection, and again, it was acquired through Beaux Arts funds. So you'll see the last of our Beaux Arts pieces, again, very modern works, and in this case, very, moving works, illusionistic works. But I want to close by saying, by showing you something that's going on behind the scenes right now. And this is, I just happened to be walking through our vault and noticed this, and I talked to our chief preparator, Trent Lawson, and he let me know we were working on the frame. So what you see here is you see the top acrylic plastic piece that has been pulled off of the painting. So if you think about, if you would turn this acrylic piece in the foreground 90 degrees and put it on top, that's how this works. So that's how there's this effect. And then when you move kind of to the side in front, as you're sort of looking at this piece, as you're moving in front of it, it'll kind of give you this sense of movement, this sense of change as you look at it. And this is again a moment in this virtual tour where we're seeing something that we couldn't otherwise see, looking in the vault and seeing how this work actually works. And so these op and kinetic pieces, many in both areas, both op, which are optical, mostly paintings, or kinetic, which are sculptures, use new materials like plastic, acrylic, and so on. So I think we're at our time limit there. I just want to thank you all for attending. A very special thank you to the Amy Harlow, who has done so much for the Beaux Arts Society this past year, David Huffman, this year's past king, who very generously contributed to the Beaux Arts Fund and helped acquire the John Singleton Copley, and to the entire Beaux Arts Society. And as another plug, please do come to Moving Vision, which opens February 21st, and Beaux Arts at 75 closes on April 25th.